my name is Allison Mendenhall. I am a principal in the Denver office of Design Workshop. All of my colleagues know that, but we do have a few guests who are treasured clients and project partners. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited about this, and Design Workshop is eager to start this conversation. So just a few housekeeping items. This is a 90-minute session, and it's approved for 1.5 professional development hours by APA and LASIS. You do need to stay for the duration to receive the credit, and you'll receive a certificate if you are licensed and certified and you indicated so for various programs when you registered. There will be a quiz for the licensed landscape architects. That's a requirement. If you wish to receive LASIS credit, you must take that quiz, which will arrive as a SurveyMonkey link in a separate email from me following the session. If you're not licensed as a landscape architect, you don't need to take it. And frankly, it makes it easier for me if you don't. But if you're really curious, it's fine. As far as evaluations, we are an approved credit provider, and as such, we're required to offer a way for you to provide feedback on this session. At the conclusion of the session, a survey link will pop up still in Zoom, and ideally you can complete it right away. However, if you're racing to the next meeting, you will also receive a Zoom follow-up email tomorrow where that link will also be included. As this is a webinar format, all attendees are muted. However, there is a way for you to weigh in and ask questions. We ask that you use the Q&A button, not the chat, to submit your questions, and that is at the bottom of your Zoom window. And if you can try to be succinct and to the point, that'll just help us to pull them out. And what I'll be doing is posing those questions to our speakers at key parts of our agenda, which you can see on the screen now. The first hour of our presentation is the presentation by our guest experts, Katie Pedito and Naomi Sachs. And then we will shift to a design review, a longstanding Design Workshop tradition for Acacia Park, and that will be led by Principal Anna Laybourne and Ben Neefield, PM and PLA. So you all have read the description and the learning objectives. That's why you are here. And I am just going to skip that and introduce our presenters, our guest experts. So Naomi Sachs is an assistant professor in the Department of Plant Science and Landscape Architecture at the University of Maryland and the founding director of the Therapeutic Landscapes Network. She has published and presented nationally and internationally on the positive role of nature in human health. Katie Pedito is an environmental psychologist and assistant professor in the Department of Behavioral Sciences and Leadership at the U.S. Air Force Academy. Her research focuses on providing healthy, equitable environments for adolescents and young adults in healthcare settings. And I just wanted to say that Anna Laybourne and I have really had the pleasure of a few conversations with Naomi and Katie, both to present or prepare for this presentation, and we're really excited about this. Anna has served on panels with Naomi in the past. We're excited to meet Katie, and without any further delay, let's start the presentation. Welcome, everyone.
All right, Naomi, I'll turn it over to you. Give me 1 second.
Great, thanks, Katie. Great, thank you, Allison, and thank you to Design Workshop. Design Workshop was actually my first internship while I was still an MLA student at UC Berkeley, and I was at Design Workshop in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So I'm very happy to be back for a little bit. So Katie and I are going to talk about the research that we have done on gun violence and green space. And Katie, if you can go to the next slide. Oh, okay. So a little bit of the origin story of this research is, and I wanted to say that this research is not just me and Katie. There are some other people on the team, including Mardell Shepley, who was my boss at Cornell University when I was in the Department of Design and Environmental Analysis as a postdoc. Katie was a PhD candidate at that time and then followed me as the postdoc after I left for UMD. Hassam Sadat Safavi was also a postdoc at that time, and now he's at University of Virginia. And Chris Fournier is a librarian at Cornell who focuses specifically on systematic lit reviews. So I think we have an image later on with an image of the paper that we presented, and you'll see all of those names come up. So part of this origin story of this lit review is all of us being appalled with gun violence and the rise and continuation of gun violence in the country. You've seen the statistics that Americans are 10 times more likely to die by firearms than in other countries, that we have far more gun-related homicides than any other developed countries, and that our gun homicide rate is 25 times more, or 25 times higher than in other developed countries. And if you can go to the next slide, Katie. So this is a stark graphic that really illustrates that point. Next slide. So as designers and researchers, we started to think about, well, is there anything that we as design researchers can do about gun violence? And perhaps something more than just voting or giving money to anti-gun violence campaigns. Maybe there's something that we can do. Next slide. And we also know that access to nature is very important, that there are many health benefits, both psychological and physiological, from both passive and active contact with nature. And we've also seen research that people in disadvantaged, particularly low-income communities, have an even greater benefit when they connect with green space than those in less affluent communities. So then our question was, well, if green space is beneficial to people, especially to those who don't have as much access to it, then could parks and gardens and trees and other types of green spaces help to alleviate gun violence and other types of violent crime? So we started to look at the existing research. We found one systematic literature review, but it was a little bit outdated even at the time when we were starting to do this literature. And the search parameters were a little bit more restricted than what we were interested in. So there were some researchers who were already exploring this relationship or these correlations between violent crime and urban green space. And next slide, yeah. So Frances Kuo, or Ming Kuo as she goes by now, and Bill Sullivan at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, they did some of the first research using a natural experiment. So basically an existing environment, which here was the Ida B. Wells housing complex in Chicago, Illinois. And you can see that some of the areas of this housing complex have a lot of trees, and some have no trees at all, or no green space really, and some are kind of in between. Thank you, Katie. And so what these researchers found when they looked at that correlation between the amounts of green space and the types of crime, looking at crime statistics, they found a statistically significant correlation between the amount of green space and the level of crime and also the types of crime. So you can see they looked at violent crime, property crime, and then the total crimes. And you see that where they're the low stands for vegetation, and there's the higher amounts of crime, and when high is the higher vegetation, that's the lower amount of crime. So that was really encouraging. And then the more recent research is by a team in Philadelphia. Michelle Kondo is with the Forest Service, Jeannie South, I think she's in Chicago, but she was brought into this team Charles Branus is an epidemiologist. And so this team was looking at interventions by the Philadelphia Horticulture Society. They have a cleaning and greening initiative. It's been going on for at least 10 years now, where they take a very simple cost-effective intervention of cleaning, picking up the trash, and cleaning up vacant lots, sometimes grading them, planting at least lawn, sometimes some trees, and putting a visually permeable fence around it, just to delineate what is the green space and what is the public right of way. And they have found, again, statistically significant differences between those cleaned and green vacant lots with houses and without houses, and those that have not had any intervention. In terms of violent crime, specifically gun violence, and also in improvements in mental health. So we were very encouraged by this, but a question when you are doing this research is, where are the gaps, right? And in order to find the gaps, you really need to do a literature review. And the most effective kind of literature review is a systematic literature review. So after looking, we did find the Bogar and Beyer lit review, but as I mentioned, that was already quite a bit of time, and that was before any of the Philadelphia Horticultural Society literature had been published. And so we decided to do another systematic literature review, which, as I was talking to Katie earlier, they're not for the faint of heart. And I think it will be a long time before I do another one, but they're just gold mines in terms of revealing what information is out there. So our goal, in addition to finding the gaps in the literature, was if we could find a positive relationship between green space, more green space, and lower incidence of violent crime, that would be really good justification for municipalities, governments, organizations to fund opportunities for green space, providing green space and providing quality green space in urban areas. So empowering those governments and municipalities to invest in green space. And our primary question was, quote, what is the impact of urban green space on the frequency of violent crime incidents post-2000? So that was our starting question. And one of the first things that we had to do was to figure out our definitions. What is green space? What is crime? What is violent crime? So, right, you have to make sure that you have all these definitions. And one definition that we ended up using for green space is land that is partly or completely covered with grass, trees, shrubs, or other vegetation, and that includes parks, community gardens, and cemeteries. However, we also found other literature that we knew that we wanted to include. So we broadened that definition a little bit to include also streets and playfields, so that we could gather information on, for example, street tree planting. And then one of the first things that one does in a systematic literature review is to define your inclusion and exclusion criteria. So for example, we only looked at English language, and we excluded all other languages because none of us spoke other languages well enough to be able to do a really rigorous screening. We only looked at any published information post-2000, and we did not include anything earlier than 2000. We only looked at exposure to violent crime and green space. So we didn't look at, for example, disturbance or disorderly conduct, right? It was more violent crime. And we didn't look at parking lots, which is an open space, but not defined as a green space. We only looked at the urban US, so we didn't look at rural or suburban. And we did come across some articles which we ended up screening out because they did not fit into this inclusion and exclusion criteria. Yeah, I think that's enough of that. And now Katie is going to talk about all the fun that we had with our screening of the various different articles and papers.
Yeah, as Naomi mentioned, systematic literature reviews are not for the faint of heart. So let me give you a sense of scale here. Our initial searches yielded over 30,000 possible papers. So using the inclusion and exclusion criteria that Naomi just explained, 30,000 possible papers. We started this search in December 2017, January 2018, and then ended up repeating it one more time about a year and a half later, just to make sure that we caught everything and our review was going to be as up to date as possible. So from those 30,000 possible papers, first we screened by title and made sure that the title was actually relevant to some of the outcomes and green space iterations we were interested in. And then we screened the abstracts. So at each level of this Prisma flowchart, you can see that certain things were excluded. So after abstracts were screened, about 3,500 articles were excluded. After the abstracts had been screened, that meant reading 327 full text articles to see if they really did fit our inclusion and exclusion criteria. In fact, most of them did not, and we ended up with 45 papers that comprise this systematic literature review, which is about 1% of the original papers that we started with. So it really was a large undertaking to make sure that we spread a wide enough net to capture the different ways that researchers were looking at the relationship between green space and violent crime. After we had all of those 45 papers together, we started to look for patterns in the variables, the outcomes, the study methods that people were using. And we found that green space independent variables really fell into 5 categories. The first one was parks. Pretty self-explanatory, and you'll hear certainly more a little bit today about what we mean by a good quality park. The second category, community gardens and vacant lot remediation. This includes some of the studies that Naomi mentioned earlier from the Philadelphia Horticultural Society and the Brannis team in Philadelphia, that these vacant lots might have been cleaned and greened. Those fall into this category. The third category is vegetated or tree-lined streets and walkways. This also includes elevated trails like the High Line or the Atlanta Beltline, looking at maybe before and after crime in those areas. The fourth one, and the biggest category, was by far tree canopies and ground cover. A lot of researchers were really interested in whether the sheer presence of trees and ground cover using spatial image analysis might actually reveal a correlation with crime. And we'll see if they did find one. And the fifth category was kind of a catch-all because we know that green space means a lot of different things. And for 2 unique studies, researchers looked at places like undeveloped green areas, the effect of green stormwater infrastructure, and the influence of landscape diversity as well. It wasn't just that there were commonalities in the operationalization of green space. There were also patterns in the behavioral outcomes, the crime outcomes, and the type of research design that these teams tended to use. Mostly the behavioral outcomes were typically homicide, assault, and theft. But often they were lumped in with other types of crime as well. So even the articles we targeted that looked at violent crime also tended to have sections that discussed nonviolent crime as well. We saw that the majority of the articles used quantitative methods. So most of them, as I hinted at before, used GIS or other spatial image analysis tools to actually take these bird's eye view photos of certain urban areas, sometimes entire cities, sometimes much smaller scale neighborhoods and areas, just to detect the presence of green space. And then ultimately they would correlate the amount of green space in these images with crime data from the municipalities that they were studying. means those studies were relatively easy to pull off, but they rely on correlational data. They don't give us a ton of causal information. We don't know if adding a park, for example, is actually going to reduce the amount of crime. That's a correlation. A few of them predicted causality using different types of interventions. So we'll talk about why those are more powerful and the conclusions we were able to draw from that. We created this matrix, which I'm sure looks a little bit overwhelming and a little bit crazy at first, but it helps to identify how these, sorry, I think I have to sneeze. It's allergy season here in Colorado. So this matrix looks at the relationship between these 5 categories of green space and the different ways that violent crime was operationalized in these studies. You can see that very few studies looked at gun violence compared to the larger amount of studies that were focused on kind of a broader definition of violent crime. As I mentioned earlier, undeveloped green areas, this alternative definition of green space, was pretty light. And then trees and ground cover made up the bulk of these 45 studies. I want to orient you to this little, this graphic down here. You'll see that on each slide following, some of the studies are going to have a green arrow. That is a good thing, right? Green space was associated with a decrease in crime. Some of them were inconclusive. There just wasn't enough data, or the methods weren't strong enough to give us kind of a yes or no answer. And then red is the more disappointing findings, that green space actually resulted in potentially an increase in crime. And we can discuss some of the reasons why that might be the case. So if we break it down into each of these 5 categories of green space, the first one was parks. And truly, there just weren't enough conclusive studies in this category to really tell us either way whether parks were contributing or detracting from violent crime in the local areas. Unfortunately, this was mainly because none of them really involved interventions. It's really, really challenging and pretty costly to look at a park intervention. That would involve taking crime data before the development of the park, waiting potentially several months, several years for landscaping to mature, for the community to become involved, and then looking at crime data again, at which point a lot of things may have changed in the outside community as well. So it becomes a little bit challenging, but I know that Anna and Ben have some interesting information to share with us about their work as well. When we look at the findings related to community gardens and remediation, we actually see some more powerful work. Again, remember, this includes the Philadelphia cleaning and greening studies, as well as a lot of other remediation studies that were done in cities across the United States. This was really encouraging because most of these studies, you can see right down here, 6 of them actually suggest that remediating blighted lots, adding community gardens, these things can reduce crime, particularly violent crime. And that's great news for city planners, for government officials, for agencies, because typically these interventions are a lot more cost effective. It is way easier to implement a community garden and do a cost effective blighted lot cleanup than it is to implement an entire city park. So we saw a lot more interventions from researchers in this area, that researchers were really able to look at pre-post studies and see how crime changed across time. Vegetated streets and walkways. Again, a limited number of studies, but really positive overall. There are some nuances to vegetating streets and walkways. So when we think about identifying a neighborhood, adding more street trees, for example, as was the intervention in several of these studies, a lot of them showed that adding street trees did reduce crime. But there is a possibility that the alternative explanation for that is not quite as positive. In the same way that adding law enforcement cameras on high crime streets does reduce crime on that street, it just moves it elsewhere. And it's possible that the greening of these streets actually just moved crime elsewhere in the local area, resulting in what we call a spillover effect. Quasi-experimental studies, just like in the cleaning and greening studies, were really common, pre-post studies, where we didn't randomly assign anyone to get green space, but we looked at what happened when we added some. Trees and ground cover. I hinted at this earlier, but you can see this is definitely our biggest portion, biggest category of green space studies, probably because it is highly accessible. It requires a lot less money and a lot less time in most circumstances to do this type of research. So it became really popular, particularly with individuals who have skills in spatial image analysis. So by obtaining these kind of bird's eye view of different areas and cities, individuals were able to correlate the amount of green space with municipal data on crime. And the majority of these studies do reflect a decrease in crime, that areas that have larger tree or ground cover have less crime. There are certainly some alternative explanations to that as well, but it is promising work. Because of the potential alternative explanations to this, most of the researchers also recommend policy changes and a lot of kind of thoughtful design when we think about where we might place ground cover and tree cover. Because certainly it's possible that the more affluent, higher socioeconomic status places just simply have more tree cover to begin with. And then finally, our little, our kind of potpourri section here. This includes two studies that were done, one by the Condo team and one by Sparks. They were two entirely different studies. So they kind of represent alternative ways of thinking about green space. The Condo team looked at green stormwater infrastructure and how that influenced the surrounding area. The Sparks team looked at land use diversity and whether or not that was associated with different types of crime. And both of them were relatively inconclusive. They were really cool, novel ways of looking at green space, but weren't quite methodologically powerful enough to identify any trends in either direction. This really highlights some of the methodological challenges that we saw across all of the categories. It's hard to figure out what green space means. How many trees are green space? How much grass is green space? Is stormwater infrastructure green space? So that leads us to a number of different challenges trying to draw conclusions from this research. So we decided we need more research. How do we fill in some of the gaps that we found in this literature review? Because we did have some positive findings, but we were left with a lot of unanswered questions. So we propose a number of different future directions. And these don't necessarily have to be done by entire academic teams. This is research that would be particularly accessible and valuable for academic practitioner teams as well. The big one we really need are meta-analyses that look at data from multiple research projects and actually take this data, combine it, and try to draw conclusions from the combined data set that's now much bigger. So we need a good meta-analysis. Luckily, part of the research team involved with this systematic literature review, led by Hissam Sadasafavi down at UVA, has a forthcoming meta-analysis. So hopefully within the next year, you'll have some more interesting information to add to this conversation. We need more studies also that focus on the mechanisms impacting behavioral responses. Why is it that green space might actually influence crime? We're not totally sure, but we do have a handful of proposed mechanisms. We call them mediators. They explain why green space might be related to a reduction in crime. We also really, really badly need intervention studies. In that second category, the community gardens and green space remediation, that was a particularly powerful category because of the number of interventions. People studied the area before they put in a garden and studied it afterwards. We also need this at multiple scales. Can we look at something a little bit bigger, perhaps, than just a community garden? Is it possible? There are certainly challenges to that, but it would really add to this conversation around green space and violent crime. One of the things that I'm particularly passionate about, I know Naomi is too, is that almost all of these studies relied entirely on quantitative data. So classic number crunching data. We really need studies that also involve the real human community perspective that you can only get by doing qualitative research, by involving people in interviews and focus groups and surveys where you actually get an idea of how the community is interacting with the park, the garden, the Beltline, for example. And it gives a kind of new richness and understanding to green space and violent crime. And then finally, although we set out looking to answer this question about gun violence, very few people were able to answer it. There were very few studies that looked specifically at gun violence. So we're hoping that we might see future research expand specifically in that direction in the future. When we think about mediators, explanatory variables, why on earth does green space reduce violent crime? We have a couple of theories that's not just our own hypotheses, but really well supported by some other literature too. It's possible that green space provides a place for communities to interact, for people to exercise, for people to access all of that good feeling that they get from biophilic experiences. By creating green space, we might create new, better defined territory and create a sense of community cohesion and potentially reduce what we call the heat island effect. So I'm going to talk about each of these individually and why we think these might be the explanatory variables involved here. This was a graphic from the paper that we published. It is, again, a little bit busy, but you can see just the sheer number of ways that we might define green space here. Garden, green belt, greenery, green area, green infrastructure. There's so many different ways that we might talk about green space. There's also a lot of ways that we might talk about the behavioral and crime outcomes. And then to just make it a little bit more complicated, there are so many different ways that these things could be related. Is it possible that gardens reduce homicide because it provides a place for the community to interact? It improves social ties in the community. That's entirely possible. We just haven't studied it quite enough yet. But we do know that the presence of outdoor space does encourage interaction. We see this on everything from porches on people's front houses to gardens and parks as well. Additionally, when people are more often gathering outside of the home, it increases the familiarity of individuals in the community with each other. It improves what we call legibility. Do you know who's supposed to be in your neighborhood, in the area at any given time? Criminals do not want to be recognized as criminals, right? So when we have opportunities for greater interaction within the community, we have a tighter knit community and a safer one as well. It's also possible that by creating green space, particularly parks, that have opportunities for exercise, we might actually be able to capitalize on the very well-known benefits of exercise in general. Urban areas are high stress. Individuals who live in urban areas have higher cortisol levels. We know that. But we also know that exercise lowers cortisol levels. It improves our mental acuity, our performance. It improves our mental health, and it might also reduce obesity. All of those things could be related to a healthier community and ultimately a decrease in violent crime. Speaking of cortisol, one of the things that we know about exposure to nature is that it really can reduce our stress levels. Exposure to nature can help us access cognitive restoration, improve our resilience, and that might also help us reduce the amount of crime in an area. Urban areas that have a higher percentage of tree cover, of green space, its citizens have reduced levels of cortisol. When we reduce the overall stress in an area, crime goes down. This one draws on principles of crime prevention through environmental design, broken windows theory, and there are kind of some interesting theories suggesting that as we create better defined territories, we can create a better sense of ownership. And when we think about things that might deter criminals, places that looked owned are typically going to be less likely as places for criminal activity. So clear territories, less ambiguity of ownership. When we have less disorder, we are making a place that is less likely to have crime. This is particularly meaningful when we talk about cleaning and greening blighted lots, and perhaps less relevant for some of the other categories. Community cohesion. And I'm excited for Anna and Ben to talk about what they have been doing, how they've been involving the Colorado Springs community in their Acacia Park design, because we know that user participation in the design process, whether it's for a building, whether it's for a park, we know that that's really, really important to the community. And that it means greater acceptance of the space. It means better maintenance over the long term. And communities might interpret this as a sign of respect from their government. It might become a source of civic pride. And in all of those ways, improves community cohesion, potentially reducing crime. And then finally, we know that there is this heat island effect that happens in urban areas, such that urban areas experience, on average, higher temperatures than their outlying areas. And that could be for any number of reasons, but particularly because of a lack of tree cover and the sheer amount of built materials used in urban areas. When we add trees and other ground cover, it's possible that that might reduce the heat island effect. That's particularly meaningful when you combine it with research showing that as temperature increases, aggression increases, rates of violent crime increase as temperature increases. So what happens if we're able to just lower the temperature of an urban area by a handful of degrees? Could that be particularly meaningful? We think so. In the year-ish since we published this study, a lot has changed in the world, to say the least. And I know all of you might be a little, not just Zoom fatigued, but maybe a little COVID fatigued in general. But I think it's really important to note that all of this research is looking at urban green space, and yet not all urban green space is created equal, and not all people have equitable access to the same high quality green space that might actually be reducing crime. So when we, at the beginning of the pandemic, started to see just how inequitable this access was, it highlighted another need in the discussion about providing good green space and how we might involve communities to make sure they are accessible as well. So what do we actually know so far? What do we still need to find out? Well, we know that a lot of our research showed that green space can be a strategy for reducing crime. Typically, as researchers, we try to avoid the word prove. So we like that green space can be a strategy, one of our tools in a toolkit that could potentially improve the surrounding community. There are several mechanisms that might explain why that's happening. Overall, good public spaces support good behavior and might potentially have cost benefits. When we think about how to maybe get funding from a government agency or a local community, proposing a park is costly. But there are ways to quantify the cost benefits of green space, especially with this type of research. So this evidence could actually empower governments and communities to put their weight behind these interventions and support this type of work. And then finally, of course, we have a need for more research. If we want more evidence to give to government agencies, we need good research. So we have this forthcoming meta-analysis from part of our research team that we're particularly excited about. We included our references at the end of this PowerPoint, so you'll be able to access those if you have any interest in further reading. And then finally, we'd like to open it up for questions and provide our contact information as well. In case you have any questions for us, you can see, as Naomi mentioned earlier, this is the the full research team here, including Mardell Shepley at Cornell University, Hassam, who's now down at University of Virginia, and Chris Fournier, who is our library support at Cornell as well. So thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure to be here. Now we're happy to take some of your questions.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much to Naomi and Katie. That was fascinating. Lots of food for thought. We do have one question in the Q&A so far. I imagine we're going to get quite a few others. Oh, here comes another one. That's great. Thank you. I'll start with the first one. How did the study account for the general correlation of more green spaces in higher income advantaged neighborhoods with lower crime rates due to less poverty?
So I will say that our systematic literature review didn't necessarily do that. That wasn't really one of the goals of a literature review. What we relied on was that the individual papers, those 45 papers we reviewed, that those researchers tried to control for the effect of socioeconomic status and some of those other demographic indicators of affluence as well. And we found that most of the studies that we included in the 45 were well controlled and often eliminated that concern.
Another question in the Q&A is, why would having vegetative streets move crime off that street into a different area?
So I can tackle that one. In the case of the Philadelphia Horticultural Society papers and research, one of the things that they found, that in a way, the PHS implemented some of those SEPTED principles. For example, putting the fence around the garden, which there was a gap in the fence, so people could still go into the green space, but still having that delineation of property was enough to give that place a sense of ownership. And it was also going to the broken windows theory of this place is cleaned up, right? So someone takes care of this place. It may be, and actually the researchers found that the vacant lots, the blighted lots, people were actually hiding guns in the trash and actually even renting out space, like parking spaces in front of the vacant lots where people were selling guns and selling drugs. And so once this was cleaned and greened, there was not a place for hiding guns anymore or hiding drugs. And it wasn't good cash flow to park next to those spaces anymore. So in some of those research studies, they were able to look at surrounding neighborhoods and control for that. And they found that it didn't have that spillover effect. But others, they weren't able to control, and they did not know, the researchers did not know whether crime was decreased overall in the city or whether it just moved somewhere else. Oh, Ashley wants to look at the mechanisms slide again.
So this is the very busy one. I'll keep this up here for a second, and then I'll scroll to some of the next ones.
What did clearly defined territory look like? What types of, I'm just curious, how would you perceive that?
So one example would be the fence in the cleaning and greening program. Another would be, I guess, just having a well-kept or well-kept green space, that if things are mown and clearly taken care of, it's that Joan Nassauer talks about cues to care, right? And so even if it's like the high line, people talk about cues to care, it looks kind of wildy. And some people might even say that it looks like it's a bunch of weeds, but because the paving and the built features like the benches and the railings, they're all very well taken care of. That is a cue to others that, oh, this is supposed to be this way. So the same thing, that would be a delineation or a clearly defined territory, that this area is clearly taken care of. Do you want to add anything to that, Katie?
Yeah, we can also use different markers to signify territory as well. And I don't know if this was specifically looked at in any of the 45 studies. I can't remember off the top of my head, but if we take a portion of an urban area, for example, that really, it doesn't have a clear ownership. It's a blighted lot, it's an empty parking lot. You're really not sure who has ownership over it. And then we put a little bit of grass and a sign. Now we have some indication that someone owns that space, and that maybe going into that space would be trespassing, or going into that space in violation of its intended use might be trespassing. By giving something an intended use, we can also clearly define it in terms of a territory.
Looks like a related question up there from Tom Klein.
Yeah, that's a really good question.
Sorry, I can't see them on my end because I've got the...
Oh, okay.
Let me see if I can pull it over real quick.
That's fine. I can read it. I didn't want to be reading if everyone could see it. So Tom is saying, Tom is a colleague at Design Workshop, is saying, do you find anything in your research that discussed issues of displacement and who felt ownership? I know broken windows has been critiqued for how the conclusions drawn by researchers altered policing in New York City as an example.
Naomi, I'll let you take that one. I know you've been interested in this.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And broken windows theory, and also CPTED, crime prevention through environmental design, there's quite a bit of controversy around that as well, because of this issue of policing. And when Katie was talking about the lack of qualitative research, that was part of the problem, that you don't get to see that really fine-grained, like, what are people thinking and feeling when these sorts of interventions happened. So one frustrating part of the Brannis and Condo and South, the Philadelphia Horticultural Society research, they actually, a part of their research was qualitative, and they hired ethnographers and they did walkthroughs and interviews and surveys, and they have not had the funding to publish that research because it's so much more time consuming to do the qualitative data analysis and then write it up. But one of the things they found was that people in very disadvantaged neighborhoods were more welcoming of green space and the cleaning and greening programs coming in. Those who were in quote unquote transitional neighborhoods, where there was more of a transition happening from the neighborhood into gentrification, people were a lot more wary of anything that was going to kick that neighborhood into being gentrified, because they were concerned about being cost out of their own homes or their rent. And so there was that tension in between. And another thing that we found in a couple of the studies where, for example, crime went up when there was street tree planting, because people were actually ripping out the trees. So the crime was tearing out the trees that had been planted. That it's really important to include the community in the design process and also in the maintenance process. So if a city or an organization takes a very paternalistic approach, and here, this is a good thing for you, here you go, and plants trees, but then that community is expected to do all of the maintenance and is stuck with something with no support system, then there's a lot of resentment. So it's a really good question.
These questions all have very natural segues. There's a question from my colleague Nicole Rebeck Stout. Is there a way to account for the possibility that the green investments actually cause gentrification or displacing the existing population? Is this topic worth integrating into future research inquiries? How can we balance green investments with a goal of retaining the existing population? I suspect investments coupled with policies for retention is one idea. What else?
Naomi, and you might have to clarify for me, but I do recall that the Brannis team in Philadelphia did look at the neighborhood cost increases and tax increases as a result of green space, and they found that it does increase property values and can potentially price people out. Am I correct about that?
It's a little bit
More nuanced than that.
gray than that. I guess so. There is a research study that just came out that I saw the headline for the article 2 days before this, and finally the researcher, for some reason couldn't access it through my university library. So the researcher has just emailed it to me, and I have not had a chance to read it. But this is out of the University of Chicago and Illinois Champaign-Urbana, and looking specifically at this question of the challenge of greening, and does that lead to gentrification, or does it lead to animosity and fear? Yes, it can lead to fear of gentrification and potential animosity, but it does not always lead to gentrification or property values going up or taxes going up. But it's a fine line, and it's definitely, I agree that, balancing the green investments coupled with policies for retention. I think a lot more research needs to be done about that. And interestingly, I heard recently that more people in geography and either anthropology or sociology are looking at this idea of just green enough. So the kind of cleaning and greening, rather than like a really super fancy park, like the High Line, for example, which has definitely, skyrocketed property values around the meatpacking district. So it'll be interesting to see where that is going, but I think it's still inconclusive. And again, having that qualitative data is going to be important in addition to the quantitative.
Naomi, Anna Laybourne has asked in the chat if you could share that study with us, and we'll distribute that. Once you've had a chance to take a look, that would be great.
Yeah.
Since Anna just came on, I'm going to give her the opportunity to ask a question. Then we have one from Sean Michael from Utah State University. And then we may have time for one more after that, but go ahead, Anna.
I was really interested in your, when you said that there need to be more intervention studies. And I wondered what data you would suggest collecting when we're in the design process before things get built, and then afterwards, if you have any guidance on the type of questions or things to pull into that data collection, as well as if you had any guidance on questions for that community perspective that would be useful for researchers to know about.
So one of the most basic things that I can think of off the top of my head is trying to integrate with local law enforcement from the get-go, seeing if they can provide anything even beyond what might be publicly available. So if we're thinking Acacia Park in Colorado Springs, I'm not sure what the publicly available crime data is there, but often it's really hard to distinguish in the publicly available crime data what is gun violence and what is not, what is aggravated assault versus what we might call more general assault. So if you have an opportunity to get a piece of data like that for several years before the iteration of the park, and then after the iteration of the park, again, for several years, the bigger snapshot we get, the more meaningful any type of change is. We can do what's called a time series analysis to get an idea of whether there is an actual decrease in crime after the implementation of something, whether that's a garden, a park. So that would be my first thought. Naomi, do you have thoughts on maybe the qualitative piece?
And Katie, would you suggest that also geographic area? I just, in some of your stuff you shared today, I was kind of learning from that it's not just about the site itself, it's maybe surrounding area. Do you have any thoughts on
So most of them took about a 1/4 mile radius around the piece of green space they were interested in, but it might be worth looking at again, I'm thinking specifically Acacia Park, so we can talk less in hypotheticals, but looking at where crime tends to occur. I know you guys have already looked at that, so that you have an idea of whether spillover is happening. So maybe it does decrease crime in the quarter-mile area around Acacia Park, but does it push it somewhere else? So being thoughtful about the geographic lines you draw could be helped by some collaboration with law enforcement.
Yeah, and I think, Anna, if I remember right, you did a kind of walking audit of the park and surrounds. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So that already you have gotten baseline data from that. You've gotten, as we'll see when you do your presentation, you've collected a lot of good baseline data about what people want, what is upsetting or bothering people in the community now about the park, how safe or not safe do people feel, what are their concerns, and then as Katie was saying, you can compare that or pair that with the existing more kind of data, quantitative data about the types of crime that are happening in that area. I think you actually collected some of that already, and we'll show in the presentation. So now you have the baseline, and then for your follow-up, you would try to gather that same information so that you're comparing apples to apples. So you might even conduct the same survey, either with the same people or a similar demographic in probably a year or maybe even 2 after the ribbon cutting has happened and things have had a chance to grow in and kind of the dust to settle a little bit.
I think we have one final question and then we'll shift to the design review. Actually, we've got 2, so we'll try to fit in 2 quickly. Sean Michael, who's our faculty in residence this year from Utah State University, is asking, on the independent variable attributes, it appears that only clearly defined territory and climate modulation speak toward offender-oriented influences. Are there others you found that seem to be pointed toward a potential offender being inclined or disinclined toward crime?
Ooh, that one's interesting. I like the way that you were thinking about maybe some of these are more positive community oriented, and some of them might be a little bit more inhibitory offender oriented. So I'm thinking, perceived order is definitely, I know that kind of falls under clearly defined territory, but it's worth making a case for perceived order in and of itself, that broken windows theory. There's a lot in environmental psychology that suggests that criminals are rational. Criminals do not want to get caught. So anything that we can do that makes a criminal feel like they are more likely to get caught is going to decrease crime. Perceived order is one of them. Territory is one of them. Views of other houses onto a park, a green space, a garden is going to increase visibility. I don't think any of the current studies looked at something like that, but it would be probably valuable to think about that. That's one of those controversial CP10 principles.
Right. It's sort of like eyes on the street, right?
Exactly.
So the more people that you have, and this is something that we did find in several of these studies, that the more people are using that green space and are not only eyes on the street or that are people in the space, then the more positive uses there will be. And if there are more people around, then people don't want to be selling drugs because there are plenty of people around to do other things. And that was actually a little bit of crime went up in the Philadelphia cleaning and greening, and that was disorderly conduct. And the reason that the researchers thought that was happening is people in the community were using those spaces and having like block parties. And so, yes, crime, the gun violence went down, and other violent crime went down, but disorderly conduct went up because people were having fun and occupying the space, and in a mostly very positive manner.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Naomi, that even though improving community interactions isn't necessarily directly offender related, it is in some ways that there are more people in the area. There's more eyes on the street. That is going to deter an offender.
So we have a final, more of a comment that I'll read, and then we'll shift to the design review. This is from Catherine Duarte, who is at the City of Colorado Springs, one of our clients, working with Anna and Ben and others at the firm. So thanks, Catherine. Thanks so much for sharing your work. The street tree findings are promising with lots of challenges in implementation. The cost of maintenance, higher water bills, trimming, and treatment for trees on private property is a barrier for low-income residents to participate in street tree initiatives. Urban canopy planning has to be nuanced to include low-income residents. So Naomi or Katie, any follow-up on that? And then we will shift to Acacia Park.
Yeah, one of the things that a handful of authors mentioned when we think about street tree planting is who picks the streets. There was a lot of inherent bias in terms of the streets that were selected for street tree planting. So it was really hard to figure out whether it was the street trees themselves that had improved the community, or was it something particular that made that community appealing, made it a candidate for street tree planting, for all of the reasons that you mentioned. Maybe it's a community organization that very deeply wants to do the right thing, but also wants to pick a community that might take better care of the trees, that might welcome this type of greening. But that could be an inherently biased selection process as well.
Okay, so I think that we can shift from Katie's presentation to Anna's screen sharing. Thanks, everyone. We're going to move on to the last half hour of this session with the Acacia Park Design Review.
Thanks, everyone. Design reviews are a tradition at Design Workshop. We do this at our projects in a variety of different stages. And why we're excited to do that today for this project is that it really does kind of feed into some of this research that was shared with us. And we'll go over this in a bit, but we have some key questions at the end that we're going to spend about 20 minutes for you all to work on helping critique this project and helping us think forward to the next steps. So we began this project in April of 2019 in the conceptual planning stages with 3 parks, really focused in the whole downtown area, which brilliance on our client's part for having approached it that way. It was very useful. And now we're in a stage where a design review is very helpful because we're getting into more detailed designs for phases of Acacia Park. And so we'll be going from some of this conceptual elements of the planning that was a community-wide effort into more of the details that we're working through now and the design elements that you can all help us critique today. Help us think forward how to apply what we learned from these excellent presenters today. So these 3 parks have a long history. They're in Colorado Springs, part of the founding of Colorado Springs. And looking at research and stories about this place, these 3 parks over time, we learned that it has had a mixed reputation. They were the key core places of the downtown, important to shaping the city. But even in 1974, we found records of public engagement that was associated with redesign of this park. Work that actually Richard Shaw of our firm had done in 1974, and he kept the notes. So it was a lovely gift for him to provide those to me. And I found words in there that were very relevant for the effort today. There were comments about what people complained about the park then in 1974 of seeing hippies in the park, and also this term they used, earth people. And that there was a lot of sense and notes about how people felt unsafe, and the level of investment in this park had not been great. So we are still fast forwarding to today's time. We're still looking at those challenges. The investment has been rather limited compared to some other more newer parks. And so this was really a chance for the city to update and think about how there have been so many shifts in how these parks are used and the interests. How can we really make these the active, vibrant places of downtown? They are located in very strategically with views to Pikes Peak Mountain. And that approach was one that helped shape the city 150 years ago as these parks, everything developed around them, but also were about connectivity. And the red on this map indicates that there have been a lot of catalytic redevelopment projects planned or underway surrounding the 3 parks. Park number 1 indicated here is Acacia, and you can see it's right on that edge of all those different changes that are planned to occur. There's also a number of cultural, civic, and educational destinations surrounding the 3 parks that would greatly benefit from the improvement of this park, but also have an important relationship when it comes to programming potential and other great opportunities there. So in that history of these parks, they've had a lot of different uses. They were originally planned with thought for those views, of course, but also as places of respite in the city. The trees canopy was really important for bringing nature into the city, and the original founders really thought that that was an important aspect of how people commune with nature and for the betterment of people living in this urbanizing city. In addition, the types of activities that took place, we found a lot of great historical photographs that showed how the bandshell was used for concerts and dance. There's bocce ball and shuffleboard, as well as just more community gatherings and activities that take place on a daily basis within the park. But many of those activities have changed with time or fallen out of popularity. And so we looked at perceptions, and this was an interesting indicator, was the Google reviews as well as the TripAdvisor reviews of how visitors to the downtown viewed these parks as not really places that would be on the top of your list to spend your time, which is a shame for a downtown park. And the types of comments we saw here certainly indicated that people's perceptions were important to that, of how they felt like it was a place that they were welcome and felt safe. Who should spend time in the park, of is it a place for kids or not? And there was a whole variety of comments that were about those perceptions and how it was viewed. And while there are events and activities that do take place in these parks, one of the things that was in those comments you can see was important was understanding the difference between violent crimes. Is it truly unsafe? Versus is it more of those that might provide a perception or that are nonviolent? And so we did find 1-year period of crime data and looked at some others to get a better sense of what is the cause, what are people reacting to, so we could design for those type of interventions that would be helpful to it. And you can see that the parks are not necessarily the main source or where most of this is happening. It is throughout downtown. And that was a really important finding. When people would talk about these parks, they'd often infer that the parks were the place of the greatest danger, but it also was not correlating well with the crime data. That's where that perceptions part was very important to understand. Colorado Springs does have a strong gun culture and high numbers of gun ownership. And in the last couple years, they had an all-time high for number of murders, 39 just this past year, and about 1,000 calls for shots fired within a year. And so that I think also relates to the overall feeling of how safe is our city, and what is our understanding about gun culture in this community related to these particular places. And we certainly found that the presence of intoxicated people, drug paraphernalia was the most problematic aspect in the comments that we saw, as well as just seeing people of differing economic means and signs of being unhoused were key indicators. So as was kind of mentioned earlier, this part of engaging the community and thinking through the design and having an influence on what would be there in the future was very important. And we use a whole variety of means to do that. I could get a whole other presentation about what pre-COVID we did for engagement of activities in the park with a whole variety of people. And post-COVID, in the early stages, when we had to shift to an online open house and how that was used. But from that, we learned things like the amount of transformation people really wanted to see for Acacia Park in particular was much higher than even one of the other parks. And the design and activities, events and happenings, all those things people saw as a different need for influencing the changes to the parks. So I'll give a little bit of orientation to you here for what is in the park today for Acacia, and we'll focus on that one over the other two parks for this presentation. So the things that people indicated they loved most, one of them was the Uncle Wilbur Fountain. It's here on the bottom left corner of the park, and it really acts as an anchor, inviting people into the park, especially in the summer when the fountain is operating. It's a place where children play in the splash pad and people gather around. Next to it, number 5, is a sunken playground. It's small and a bit outdated and not in great maintenance care. And this brown shape here is it's temporarily an ice skating rink. So in the winter, they install a temporary rink in this location that in just the last few years, they've been doing this, and it has become wildly popular in the wintertime. Bandshell is number 2 in the bottom center. And as you can tell, they've retained that. It's the one historic element of the park that really people said they appreciate what it looks like, even though it is hardly used. And then just a couple other notes. You can see fairly good tree coverage still today. This was at times a visitor center. It's not quite functioning that way. And this is where the bocce and shuffleboard courts are located that are not highly used. So some of the things that were helpful in thinking through our design principles was understanding what kinds of changes people would like to see. And you can see from the word cloud, people brought up words like safety and family and clean were very important, security. And the top things when surveys that people said would help the most is safety and security being addressed, cleanliness, restrooms, and special events, as well as the natural environment elements. So we came up from that with 4 design principles for this project. One was activating the parks, creating more vibrant year-round activities to take place, since we saw the success of having this story coffee. That was another key part that people appreciated about the park. They've had a concessionaire move in not too long ago that has been very positive effect on the park and people having a destination to go there. The second one was art, and thinking about how there's an attraction to this place and what is drawing people into it. Nature was the other. The tree canopy in particular was what was drawn out from that, and a sense of welcoming, inclusion, that everyone should be there. So for this, given the dilemma of the project, we produced something for the client that was, we just didn't have a resource to go to. So we created a white paper about the perceptions of homelessness and what can parks and recreation providers do to address it. And there were a whole variety of different sources that helped direct our client, and there were others that helped direct our design team. So I shared out that paper prior to this presentation, and it's on the portal as well for all of you to reference, that really helped direct us in how to consider the future interventions going forward. And these 7 items were the ones that were really highlighted of what parks and recreation providers can do to address it. And there were a number of things under that top one of planning and design process that they brought into play, as well as design features and thinking about how we can bring in programming and what the enforcement response should be going forward. I'm only quickly going to share these items here, but we can come back to it later if you have questions on it. But these were some of the physical characteristics that were associated with poor risk. And Acacia Park had quite a few of these. Confusing layout, poor lighting, some areas of physical and visual isolation were some of the key ones. And then I think a little bit of that was a bit of poor maintenance, but it was very challenging to keep up on the maintenance needs, especially in areas where like pavers and such that need to be replaced. How can safety be addressed through design was another aspect that is highlighted in that white paper. And I'll go into some of these items in our next slide here about how we went about addressing those. So in developing 3 different alternative designs, we looked at all of them to measure how some of these principles about safety could be evaluated. So sight lines, how you cluster activities together, what is next to each other that's beneficial, And looking at these edges were all some of the things that we had quantitative measures to as well, and also looking at how lighting might be influential. So this was the final preferred site plan for the overall Park of Acacia, and it centered the ice skating to have a destination in the middle rather than where it had been on the left-hand side, and created a network on the left-hand side of different play interventions and really activated that edge that was so important. Some of the things retained include the band shell, but looking to modify it so it is more useful. As well as the concessionaire aspect of wrapping that around the ice in the future once the park is more activated with these elements. We of course kept nature in this park with the tree grove on the right-hand side being even more emphasized, and having that place of quiet respite in the park along the street that is kind of most active with pedestrians. And Ben's going to take it from here, talking about this next phase of design and how we've been looking at the park.
Thanks, Anna. My name is Ben Neefield, and we heard very loud and clearly that there should be 3 primary program elements in the master plan development. So this idea of play, not just for kids, but something exciting for adults as well. This area for active zones where the community can come together, and also a passive zone to allow for a space where people have historically used this park for respite and seeking nature. So if you look at the diagram on the right, one thing that Anna alluded to is the perception of safety was really critical for the public and also the design. And we want this to be a welcome park for all using it. So we took that to heart. And the first phase of the area we're working on is the playground. So in the upper left, you see the zone that we're actually working in with Jamie Fogel and Amanda. The top right photos up there are the Uncle Wilbur fountain that we're drawing inspiration from the design, but below that is the existing playground, and it's in a location where it's perceived as kind of dangerous, kind of in the middle where it's not active, and also it's sunken below, so a lot of people aren't using it. So one thing we've thought of doing is placing this over to the left side to really activate that edge. But as you see in the party down at the bottom, we want to provide sight lines into the park, but we also want to create a spatial barrier. And then finally, the 2 bottom images are this idea of this community climbing structure that everybody can play on, and drawing inspiration from the colors of the Uncle Wilbur fountain by creating a toddler area with rolling hills below, a couple slides and spinners. And then up at the top is a more active zone for older kids. And then you see the planting barrier on the left, and the idea is to open it up more with grass lawns to the right, to the more active zones of the park. So with that, well, and here's some perspectives as well. So we use this as a study model to make sure that we weren't impeding any views. One thing that's important throughout the park in general is making sure we don't go above 3 feet on any berms to allow for sight lines, but also making sure you can see through, not just through the playground, but really through the sight lines across the park in general into the center. And I think that concludes what I'm sharing today. Thanks.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions for you all just to start guiding this conversation a bit, but then really wanted to open it up and see what else you are thinking about it. So if you have any questions to start, we can go into that, but these are the 3 that we thought of would be useful for our team to learn more from all of you, and maybe some of the lessons from the previous presentation can be useful to this. So first of all is, what considerations for safety should the team have as we're looking at more of the detailed design, instead of that higher level view that we gave at the beginning about layout and such? What programs, policies, partnerships, or other non-physical changes should we encourage our client to take on and do as next steps? And third, when we talk about these intervention studies and we're thinking about how we might measure things, what metrics might be of use in evaluating the success for safety and inclusion? So with that, any points that people want to bring up with questions for us, or do you want to jump into some critique and evaluation that would help our team? Allison, do we have anything in the chat?
It looks like not quite yet, but certainly Naomi and Katie, you feel free to come back on and ask any questions or give any feedback to the group. Love to hear from everyone.
Well, I had a question. I noticed when you showed the crime statistics that the most, not so much with violent crime, but the I guess like burglaries and drugs, drinking. So that's more on the east. If that's north facing, then that's on the east side of the park, which is possibly because there's a really big road there. There is research that the busier the road and the access, and also at kind of intersection points, that's generally where crime tends to be. So it may just be that that's a busy road. People are going by, they're selling drugs or doing drugs. But could it also be something about the park as it is now that allows people to hide, allows people, I'm not sure. So the one concern that I had was if the park that you are proposing, if the design is that more quiet kind of green space without much programming like you have in the, that you've put in the center and so much in the play area, would that mitigate the risk of not so productive activities happening in that area still?
That's a very keen observation. Thank you for that, Naomi. I think partly it's the tenant on the right-hand side of Nevada Avenue is the YMCA, and they do not have good eyes on the street. I'm really hoping that their redevelopment plan that they've been touting and showing, but it hasn't been coming online, that does show a lower level interaction, that it would be really positive. And we propose that they should have a crosswalk and introduced across Nevada Avenue that would help create more connectivity. And we talked to them about more programming in the parks happening there. But I think that's a really good observation about what kind of, this is the location where you've got ground cover and more passive recreation, that we really should be thinking about what that means for that edge condition.
Another comment about edges, a question from Anisha. Can you talk a bit about the edges and the activation around the park? I think I don't know if there's anything more to say.
I think Ben might have a little bit to add to that, to point out what's going on those edges a bit, and kind of describe a little bit more about this plan. But I think that those edges, we were looking very much at sight lines, as well as combining uses together that were advantageous to each other. But I think that observation about the right-hand side is really important.
That's correct. And also, again, we're primarily focusing on phase one right now. So again, we think it's really important to have a buffer between the street and also the park, but you're providing openings. So whether that's planting, maybe in a future phase, it's seating off to the right. But again, we're still trying to prioritize where those sight lines and really kind of lead you into the park with some excitement with those play features. So you provide openings strategically through the planting and the sidewalks to get you in there, but you still feel a spatial enclosure from the street.
And that was partly where the seating along this edge of the street where there was parking was really an important thing in its relationship to future concessions. Oops, I skipped there. There we go, back. And you can see some of the other aspects that were intended for being a draw along this edge of really opening this up as a bit of a gathering plaza on this corner.
Ben and Anna, there's some comments from Claire Hempel in the chat, both questions about, in terms of metrics, is it possible for the city to do intercept surveys after the park improvements are done to get public input on safety perception, and some suggestions, some examples or precedents with Downtown Austin Alliance.
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
I'm really curious about sort of standardizing some questionnaires for this. I haven't found one to really build off of that gets at that perceptions of safety that's asked in so many different ways sometimes, that if anyone has any suggestions or can provide an example of questionnaire, it'd be really helpful. Bluehole, it looks like, is suggested. Katie or Naomi, have you come across anything that would be a pre and post design questionnaire to be, or anything you found the way that researchers are asking these questions about safety?
I think since you've gathered the data with your walking audit, and I just was posting in the chat that, you know, you have the reviews already, as unglowing as they were, or as dull as they were. And so, you know, to look in a couple years and see what the reviews are. I don't know whether the park has a Facebook or an Instagram page right now. So anything that you that you've used now as baseline, I would stick with that for this project, and, you know, do a similar engagement so that you can find out later how people are thinking about it. For future projects, there are certainly, you know, more standardized evaluation tools that one can use, but rather than switching midstream, you'll want to stick with what you gathered for baseline.
We have some time for before construction that we still could fit something more in to do a standardized rather than our more made up way that we use.
Okay, yeah. Well, there are
I'm interested in inclusion in particular, mostly because I don't have an answer to that, because we don't even really know how to quantify inclusion particularly well, let alone in the context of an open space that opens onto the community. So I'm just interested in seeing how you follow that line of thought. And I think it lends itself to qualitative research. I don't think you're going to be able to find a standardized measure for inclusion within a city park right now. So yeah, that's just really cool. I'm glad you're thinking of it. I wish I had better suggestions about measuring inclusion.
A couple more questions in the Q&A from Catherine Duarte. There is a high school across the street just northeast of Acacia. Are there examples of blending school campus activities and public park activities in the programming plan?
That is a good question. I don't think I've come across many that are high school related. There's one in San Francisco that I was looking at for more of, they had a YMCA and a school that was for younger kids, and they had a lot of programming with that. I don't know if others have come across them, but please put them in the chat if you have some suggestions there, because we definitely heard and included the high school students. There's one on our overall committee for the project, and she looked, and many others who ended up becoming volunteers for this and helped us get the survey out. It was really useful in understanding how the students use the park today and what they'd like to see for its future. But the sort of offering of programming with it didn't quite come with that yet. So I think that's a great suggestion of how to move forward.
We have a question. Oh, go ahead, Ben.
They've also talked a lot about wanting dining spaces to dine, because they walk across the park to go get their food. So providing a central space where it's a little bit flexible, they can sit under the trees, and they can make their way back. That starts to inform some of the backbone of circulation hierarchy.
Yeah, all my research about outdoor education, it's focused not on urban parks. It's not as much about what kind of programming to provide in the center of the city. They're all about kind of taking them to nature centers and other places. So that's an interesting one to explore.
But I love that idea, because there was a great research study that was done by the organization Nature Sacred. And they asked people all over the country, what is nature? And there's some wonderful videos of people like standing in front of a beautiful park saying, oh, nature is Yosemite, and I wish I could go there. But it's right behind you. That's nature too. And so, you know, as a way to get kids who are still in K through 12 thinking about nature and how to take care of and access nearby nature, rather than just like, oh, that's something that you do 2 weeks out of the year that you have to drive 500 miles to.
Mm-hmm.
We are at our time, and I did just send out the link to the quiz for design workshop people. And if people need to jump off, if we do have a few more minutes, I'm not sure. I don't want to go too far over, but since it is a design review, there are a couple more questions. Jacob Kraft has asked if there have been studies of activity, perception, and safety of the park throughout different times of the day.
There hasn't been a study about times of the day. That's an interesting one as well. It closes at dusk kind of thing. Like they don't have a way to physically close it, but that's when they start saying, please move along or whatever. But the evening time is when all the restaurants around here, people are out for that. And there were a lot of comments from the public saying, we'd love for this park to have an evening draw, and for people to feel like after dinner, this is the park to wander into and spend some time. So certainly that time of day and all year round aspect was important for thinking about this park, and was part of our study as well, how to activate it for more 24/7 year round.
There are some comments in the chat, which we can capture for the team. Some specific questions instead of comments that I'm going to pull out is from Nicole for policy recommendations. What about rent control for surrounding tenants, or providing support to existing businesses, maybe with a partnership with a downtown business district?
Yeah, the downtown partnership participated quite heavily and got out to their constituents, which was really useful for this. And they're just trying to fill apartments downtown right now, but there's actually fairly high vacancy, and the rates for rentals are not that high currently compared to many downtowns. So that Renaissance stage, they're in a different spot than a lot of other cities. And so this park is one that right now is a problem for trying to get people to come down to live downtown, rather than it being one that they're really thinking that now is the time to put in rent control aspects. But certainly the surrounding tenant support is an important one to this. And we had a lot of discussions about how concessionaires in the parks cannot compete with the businesses around. They need to be synergistic.
And maybe this can be a final question comment, just so we end not too many minutes past our time. And actually, I think when you use the word synergies, it was in this question, if I remember correctly. Yes, Callie New is observing that the corridor to the east has more civic community, while Tejon has restaurants and commercial use. That the levels of activity and eyes on the park likely differ in the night and day on those two sides. And then are there synergies that can be created between the uses on Tejon and the west side of the park, with places to gather and eat, somewhat piggybacking on earlier questions and comments. Tejon being a lower stress corridor than Nevada, activities might blend between the public right away and the park.
Yeah, that's a great observation. And the surrounding blocks, this exhibit has a great view of it that you're kind of looking onto in the backdrop. On the outer edges are where all the great, kind of restaurants and shops and galleries form this sort of L-shaped wedge around it. And then on the other side of the L, it is not the greatest uses for that sort of engaging or participatory stuff. And so that partly informed this L shape we put into the park then, of that relationship. So you can do a bit of a loop then between those uses and wrap around. It was partly some of our considerations in this locations, because on this edge here, but across this busy street, it's like a fast food place that doesn't have a great, frontage to this. So that was some of the thoughts about the locations for synergistic relationships. We also had this note from our client that was really useful. It was that, coffee, the Story Coffee that is currently located near the bandshell has been very important for making people feel like there is a presence and territory in the park. And they've done a great job of outreach to create a more welcoming, inclusive place for all. So they've been a wonderful tenant. The idea about additional concessions, though, they wouldn't want to be located on their own in the middle. So we would really not want to move them until there are more concessionaires to join them. to create this row, because right now being located along this walkway has been a very great advantage for them to pull people in, and they're very visible. So it's a phased approach to thinking about the locations for concessionaires.
Well, thank you, everyone. When Anna and I were trying to plan this and think, we knew we couldn't really go beyond an hour and a half. Well, we knew we could talk forever, but people have busy days and schedules, so 90 minutes seemed about right. I know it's a jam-packed schedule, a very short design review, but this is a lot of good food for thought, and we appreciate everyone attending. Thank you so much to Naomi Sachs and Katie Pedito for presenting on their research today. As we all know, these sessions, we try to tie to the work itself and expand our knowledge, but they're not meant to just be this one-off occasion. The idea is to build our network and relationships, and ideally the opportunity to collaborate and partner with the people who share their knowledge with us. So Naomi and Katie, we would love to engage with you again in a project context, in any context, following up on some of these research ideas. So let's be in touch. And again, everyone, thank you for your time today. Take the survey, please, when it pops up on the window. Naomi or Katie, anything you'd like to say as we say goodbye?
Just thank you so much. This has been terrific.
Yeah, this was awesome. We love the opportunity to present, to get our research out of the ivory tower and into the hands of people that can do things about it. It's wonderful to see how some of these are already integrating into this park design, Anna and Ben.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.